Hello, my name's Jake Ruse and I'm going to show you the new target setting tool which has been developed for the agencies affected by the Carbon Neutral Government Program. This tool allows you to extrapolate what your future emissions might be for your organisation given a set of reckons or assumptions about the future. And then it compares that projected pathway of your emissions to a target level associated with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to start out using this tool, you need to have a completed emissions inventory for your organisation, which includes your emissions factors, and your activity data. Those are the two main inputs for this tool. So I'm going to take you through this step by step to show you how you would set it up and what the tool shows you. So in this tool, I have preloaded some inventories of some organisations, example ministry, example council, and example DHB. I'm going to use all of these in these videos to demonstrate various functions of the workbook. But let's just start with the simplest one, which is example ministry. So you see these green tabs here. We've got EFs, which stands for emissions factors. This is the first one you want to set up. Then we move to projection. And from there, you can put into actuals as well if you have them. That's optional if you don't have any. If this is the first year you're producing in a greenhouse gas inventory, you won't have any actuals yet apart from your base year. So that might be more useful in future years. And then finally you'll see your outputs. At the moment outputs are blank because we've got no data in here. So I'll show you those once we've populated them. So say your example ministry here. This is your greenhouse gas inventory. You've got a selection of emissions sources. They have their scopes defined here, and then they have activity data. Example ministry here has been actually recording their emissions for a few years, so we've got 3 years worth here. So let's use 2017-18 as the base year. So here are all the activities which have an emissions factor associated with them. Note I've got electricity at the top. That's going to be handy in a moment. If your electricity isn't at the top of your inventory, you might want to move it there. And so I'll just copy all of these. These are all unique values. There are no double ups here. So I can just copy this across, and then over here in activities, I'll paste values, always paste values because we want to keep the formatting there. So there we have all our different emissions sources. Now we'll go back and get the units, which are all here. We'll copy those across as well. You can also use an equal sign. If you don't want to copy and paste, you could just go equals and then reference the cells in your inventory rather than copying. That's entirely up to you. Right, so there we've got all of the names of the emissions units, emissions sources and the units. And then we need the emissions factors. So these are over here. They're in units of tons of CO2 per unit of whatever, in this case, passenger kilometres, kilograms, and so forth. You can just get these numbers by simply dividing your total emissions by your activity data, and that is your emissions factor. So very easy to get once you have a completed inventory. So I will copy those across. And since we are doing the 2017-18 year, I will post them into this column here, 2018. In this workbook, 2018 refers to the financial year 2017-18, or of course, if you use calendar years, then 2018 itself. So we'll paste those values in. And you can see they propagate out into the future. So what we assume is that in all future years, the emissions factors will be the same. Now that may not necessarily be the case, but they may change a little bit over time, in which case you can change them. You can overwrite these values if you like, but it's a pretty safe assumption. The only emissions factor that we expect some serious movement in is grid electricity, which is why we've predefined it for you up here in the first row for you to use. And there is an assumption that we've built in there about what that emissions factor is going to do in the future. So you don't need to work out which is the best assumption about future emissions intensity of electricity. It's already there for you. So we move across to projection. First thing we should do is put in the organisation name, which this case is example ministry. That will appear in the graphs. The base year is already set to 2017-18, so that's fine. Then we have this value end year. Now, end year is just where you want the simulation, the forecast or projection, whatever you want to call it, where you want it to cut off. So this could be changed to 2050. That means all the outputs, all the graphs will show the projection out to 2050. However, you may not be interested in modelling that period, so you probably want to set the time period closer in. I'm going with 2035. Bear in mind that the two target years for the carbon neutral government program regarding your gross emissions are 2025 and 2030. So your immediate issue is to set targets for those 2 years, 2025 and 2030. So it doesn't make sense to be projecting out too far beyond that. We could even set this to 2030 if you like. Right, moving on. Now we want to populate all of these green cells here. We're just going to skip over performance metrics for a moment and go down to the actual emission sources. So what we can do is we can go back over here and again copy and paste those emissions sources. Remember, leave grid electricity as the first one, so leave that one blank and then paste special in here. And then I'll put grid electricity in the top, and I'm just selecting it using the drop-down list. So all of the emission sources that you put into EFs will be available using a drop-down here. So that's how I pull grid electricity across. Now, category. Category is the new word for scope. So you'll be familiar with scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. These are now called categories. So scope 1 is category 1, scope 2 is category 2, and scope 3 is category 3, 4, 5, and 6. So you might need some advice as to how to split out your scope 3s into 3, 4, 5, and 6. But it's pretty simple. Business travel is category 3, and anything else is category 4. Category 5 and 6 are about upstream and downstream emissions from your organisation, which isn't probably very relevant to CNGP agencies. But I suggest if you haven't already sorted out your categories, just use category 3 and 4 to sort them out. So here we are. Business travel, business travel, business travel, all category 3, category 3, category 3. Paper use in the office, that will be category 4, because it's not business travel. Car, that's business travel, category 3. Rail travel, category 3. Rental cars. Now, previously, these might have been put into scope 1 or scope 3. Under the new regime, which is called V3, these are now a category 3 emission source. So I'm going to straighten that out now and just put them into category 3. However, just bear in mind that which category you put an emission source into won't actually affect the total emissions or any of your tracking towards the target. Or your simulations. So if you want to put it into a different category or you've been advised differently, that's fine. You can go with a different scope or category for those. And now I'm just coming to the bottom, taxi, that's business travel in category 3 as well. And then finally, waste to landfill is category 4. Done. All right. Now we will pop over here to base the activity data and again get it from the spreadsheet. So here it is. Here's the activity data. Again, I've got the electricity at the top. I'll bring that across separately just to be safe. So copy, paste special values. Okay, and then I'll go get electricity. I'll use an equal sign for that one just because. There it is, 600,000 kilowatt hours or so. Well, that's all populated. Right, so those are the green cells. So the idea of this color coding is that green cells is where you're entering data about that is real data about the organization right now. Whereas the yellow cells is where you enter your guesses or reckons or whatever you want to call them, ideas, hopes, you might say, thoughts about what might happen in the future. So let's just finish populating this. Let's see. So first of all, we have to decide on the basis of reduction. So there's two ways you can enter changes to your activity data in these cells from column I onwards. You can enter them as absolute numbers. So if we're talking kilowatt hours of electricity, you could say, well, in 2021, I expect us to use 10,000 more kilowatt hours than the year before, in which case you would enter 10,000. However, if your basis of reduction, so that is called activity data, if you want to use absolute numbers. Okay, so let's see, we'll enter that in, 10,000 extra kilowatt hours. However, there's another way to do it, and that's relative to the previous year. So you might say instead, I expect in 2021 that we will use 20% less electricity than the year before. So enter -20 instead. Okay, but you have to change this basis of reduction to percentage change. So there we are. We've got a percentage in there. So that's that. So before the graphs will populate, you have to choose something for all of these. So I'll just do, you can change it whenever you like. So I'll just put activity data in there. And then we have got the BAU growth trend. So there's two ways to enter changes. There is the one I just described, where it's your reckons about the future or some known information about the future. So you know for a fact that in a certain year you're going to open a new building and you have a consultant report that says how much electricity that building is expected to use. Well, you will put that in because it's something you know about. Or alternatively, you might know that in a certain year you're going to get rid of the coal boiler and put in a wood boiler instead in a particular year, and you know how much coal you're using. So in that year, it might go, you might say, all right, well, this coal boiler is going in that year, we're going to go bring coal to zero, in which case you would say perhaps percentage change and go -100%. That will bring that line down to zero. Okay, so those are known changes, but we also have this other column here, which is called BAU growth trend. So the idea of this column is that if your organization is growing, then you might expect some of these categories of activity, these emission sources, to also grow as a result. All other things being equal. So say you continue to use the same technology, but there are more people in your organization, so you expect to use more electricity in your office building, and you expect to use drive further because you've got those staff traveling to site, so you expect your fuel use to go up. So then you could put in an assumption here about the future. So let's say, well, expect that sort of background rate of growth in activity, all other things being equal, not implementing any kind of efficiency savings. We might say that's going to go up by 2% per year. You can leave this blank or set to 0, in which case the trend line is 0. It doesn't have any effect. So it's only there if you want to use it. There are certain activities where you think, well, you know, all things being equal, yeah, more staff equals more flying. So yeah, we'll put something in for flights, those rows there. But other areas you might think, well, no, I think that's pretty static. I don't think that will change very much. So electricity might be one. You might say, well, actually our office building is not necessarily going to use a lot more electricity for extra staff. It might actually be negligible, people bringing in their laptops or what have you, because the building is heated and has lighting anyway. So you might set that one to 0. And of course, you could enter a negative rate as well, if for any reason you think an activity is going to shrink away. Now, what you might have noticed is as I'm doing these changes over here in these yellow cells, that this column here, column A, these little lines are wiggling up and down. So let's just get rid of that 1% again. If you just look at cell A17, you see it's an upwards trend line. Well, if I set that back to 0, it goes flat. So what those cells are doing is showing the profile of activity data based on all of the reduction or increases, all the changes that you have entered. So you can see here in column A16, I've got that negative 20% in there, and you can see there in cell A16, you can see that step change of negative 20%. If we increased it to positive 20%, it goes the other way around, and so forth. So yeah, that column A, that's quite handy for you to see what's happening with each individual emission source, given the assumptions you have about the future. So I'm just going to explain in a little bit more detail how the projections work, just so you don't get tripped up. So all of the changes that you enter here are relative to the previous year. And if you don't enter any changes, it assumes that the previous year's value gets carried across. So as you can see there, if you look at this 10,000 that we entered up here on row 16, we can see the profile over here in A16. It's a step up and it stays up. Okay, so that's good for kind of operational activities which are ongoing. So electricity consumption, fuel consumption, they tend to be ongoing things, not one-off activities. However, you might have one-off activities that are just a spike or an occurrence that just happened in 1 year and 1 year only. Now, how would you enter that? I'll show you how. So say you were constructing a building and you wanted to include the emissions concerned with cement, concrete use for that building. So you would set up an emissions line for concrete, and in the year that it was going to occur, you would enter the quantity of concrete. So let's just imagine this first row is concrete. Let's say 2024, we're going to use 1,000 tons of concrete. Okay, so that's pretty simple. You just put in 1,000 if the line is set up for concrete with the emissions factor being per ton. However, that just makes a step up. I'll get rid of this one as well, just so it's clearer. So you can see here on the quick view, yeah, it's just a step up. So hold on, we're not going to use 1,000 tons of concrete every year forever. It was just that 1 year. What's the answer? Well, the answer is in the next year to put in the negative quantity. Okay, and that will bounce. Will make what happened in the previous year a one-off. So over here in quick view, you can see a spike, and then it goes back down. So that's how you do one-offs. Another thing to note is with the percentage change, it's percentage change relative to the previous year. So as you can see here, where we've entered all of these negative 10s, the line kind of curves down. It doesn't go straight down, it curves down. That's because it's 10% less than the previous year. So every year, there is still something left. It's just 10% smaller than the previous year. If you wanted a percentage reduction to go to 0, you would have to enter negative 100%. And that would bring it down to absolutely nothing, okay? Because 100% less is 0, right? I should note here that reductions are entered as negative numbers and increases are positive numbers, just for consistency's sake, because not necessarily every change that's coming in the future will be a reduction. Some might be increases as well. So that's how you denote the difference between the two. So say a new building was opening, that would obviously be a new source of emissions. So you'd enter a positive number for that. Whereas if you were implementing energy efficiency measure at a building, well, that would be a negative effect and you would take that off. Now, as you enter these changes over here, they should be really based on something. So some might be, guesses. Others might have some really good data underpinning them. So in any case, whatever numbers you put in here, it would be good to note where they came from. So say grid electricity here, say that you know about this new facility opening up, and you know it's going to use 10,000 kilowatt hours a year. So you put in 10,000. Oh, that should be set to activity data. Yeah. Okay, and then what probably sensible to do is to add a comment here and just say what it is and say new facility opening figure from consultant report dated XXX. All right, so now when you go back there and say in the future, or if someone else is looking at this worksheet, they can click on the cell and very quickly get an idea of where these numbers are coming from. Now, coming back to the KPIs at the top here. So the Carbon Neutral Government Program targets, gross emissions targets that need to be set, absolute contraction. So they're concerned about the total tons of CO2 your organisation is producing. Having said that, you may want to track your emissions based on an intensity measure or KPI. So how many tons of CO2 per something is the organisation producing? And this is where you enter the something. So these somethings could be millions of operating revenue, a typical one. They could be number of FTE staff. It could be the number of widgets that the organisation produces. Or they could be number of customers. These can be anything you like. Anything that you want to measure your emissions intensity against, you can put here. And this is where you'd enter the base year values. So say, in base year, this organisation had a operating revenue of 5.5 million. It had 300 staff. It sold 1,000 widgets, and it had 500 customers. That's where you enter your base year values, which are used for those performance metrics. Also, if you like, you can put in an assumed rate of annual growth of those things. So let's say that operating revenue is increasing by 1% per year, staff increasing by 2% per year, widgets 3% per year, and customers by 2% per year. And you can see here that the numbers are increasing based on that fixed annual percentage of growth. You can also enter a negative number if you want, if you expect those things to shrink and contract. So that's your projected metrics, which, as I say, are used to in some of the outputs. Now I'm going to show you the Actuals tab. Now this is where you enter actual performance, actual emissions inventory results in future years. So this is probably after you've done your target setting. You come back to the spreadsheet and want to track progress against that original projection. This is where you put the results in. Now you can see in column D here, the base year emissions have already been pulled across from the worksheet projection. Now, if your base year is a single year of data, then what you'll want to do is simply put an equal signs to pull the base year data across to the first year of the time series with an equal sign like that. The reason why we haven't just dumped this data base year emissions straight into the first year, the base year as specified in projection, is that you might want to use averaged data for your base year. This is actually permissible under the scheme rules. If we do that, then obviously your base year will be different numbers to your actuals, because actuals always relate to a specific year. So it's just a case of putting in an equal sign and pulling those results across if you don't have an average base year. If you do have an average base year, then you would copy and paste across the original results. Now I'll just do that now for those other years, 2019 and 2020, because we happen to have them. So here are the results here for 18-19. Let's copy those. And put them into here. As usual, I'm doing electricity separately. Yeah. And let's do 2020 as well. I'll go over here, copy those. And we'll get the electricity, which is actually for some reason in two separate lines. Not quite sure why. One's additional, one's not. Let's just add them together for simplicity's sake. There we go. Done. We've got the actuals, and then they'll appear in the emissions results as the orange bars. Or, well, the bars, depending on which graph you're in, they might be different colors. As well as entering actual emissions result, you can enter your actuals for the metrics, if you have defined any of those. Just like the emissions, it is separated into something called a base year value and then specific years. This allows for averaged base year or baseline, if you want to call it that. Yeah, but then just like with emissions, you can enter actuals here, say 302 staff, 1,100 widgets, 550 customers, just like that. The first Outputs tab is all the results summarized by various measures. Quite hard to grasp at first glance. So let's move across to output summary. But all you have to know is that all the outputs, well, most of the outputs are here for you to copy and paste out of this worksheet or graph in some other way if you wanted to. Here's the output summary. So what we've got here, the most important row for CNGP is row 6. it tells you your baseline emissions. It tells you the projected level in 2025. It tells you the amount of change in 2025 compared to baseline. And it tells you the gap with the requirement of CNGP for 2025. When I say it's the requirement, what it is the level of reduction which is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And 2025, that is a 21% reduction compared to your base year. Then it also tells you all those same things, but for 2030. Then finally, it tells you your projected level and change compared to the base year for your end year. Remember the end year we entered for where your simulation cut off? Well, in this case, it's 2035. So what you can see here are the actuals are the orange bars. The grey line is the projection based on all of the information that you entered into the sheet projection. And the blue line is the level of reduction which is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Well, you don't necessarily have to stay below this line the entire time in order to meet the requirements of the Carbon Neutral Government Program. But what the government is seeking is you to set targets for 2025 and 2030 for your gross emissions, which are consistent with 1.5 degrees. So that would be below the blue line at those 2 points in 2025 and 2030. Now, as you can see, at the moment, example ministry is nowhere near that. They're way above that line in those 2 years, and in fact the entire time. So we're going to have to go back to projections and enter some more changes. So let's do that now. We'll go to projection, and let's pick an emission source which is fairly substantial, like long-haul business travel, and we'll say that each year they'll reduce by 10%. Okay, for 5 years. All right, so let's see what that's done. Well, that's had a dramatic effect. As you can see, doing that has brought the grey line down quite a long way. And in fact, in 2025, the grey line is below the blue line. So if we go back to output summary, here we have a lovely green set of cells saying that the amount of reduction in 2025 is 24.4%, which is a greater reduction than was required, which is 21%. And the gap is 43 tonnes. So they've actually overshot the target level, or I should say the 1.5 degree level by 43 tonnes. So that's pretty good. But you can see here in 2030, it's still red. And that's because over here, you can see the grey line switches to being on the wrong side of the blue line again. So if we go back to projection, so we're going to reduce this even more, another 10%, another 10%, another 10%. Well, we're getting closer. Why don't we do something with another emission source? Let's look at another large one. Domestic air travel. Why don't we reduce that by 5% per year? Remember, change the basis of reduction to percent change. Okay. 5, -5, -5, -5. Oh, that's gotten us pretty close. All right, let's just do a little bit more. -5, -5. Yep, I just squeaked across the line. So you can see here, we've got green cells. The target level was the 1.5 degree consistent level was -42%, and now we've got -42.6. So what that's telling us is that based on everything we entered here, projected out to the future, it looks like we can meet a level of reduction which is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees for the 2 target years. After that, things go a bit skew-if, but anyway, we'll worry about that another time. So that demonstrates how you can use the tool to assess changes, and if they're going to be impactful enough for you to meet a level of emissions reduction consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Now I'm going to explain the 1.5 degree requirement target line, which appears on the graphs here, and also forms the basis of these green and red boxes, which are telling you about whether the projection that you've put into projection gets you to the 1.5 requirement level or not. So the origin of this line is the SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative Foundation document. And the research they did of possible future global carbon emissions pathways were that ones that were consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees reduced on aggregate by 4.2% per year between 2020 and 2035. So that's exactly what is plotted on this graph here as the dark blue line. Now, your base year may not be 2020. In this particular example I've got in front, it is set to 2020, and you can see that the projection that's included here does track down more or less following the blue line to achieve that target level in 2025. However, it doesn't in 2030. Let's not worry too much about that right now. I just want to show you what happens if the base year was earlier or later. So if we go through projection and set it to 2018, and just say for argument's sake that all of this activity started a lot earlier, you can see the blue line is actually level between 2018 and 2020, and then it starts coming down. That's because the projection was specifically for the period between 2020 and 2035. So if your base year happens to be earlier than 2020, then essentially you've got more time between the start of your emissions reduction program when you started measuring and managing your emissions in 2025. So you're going to find it easier to reach that level of reduction, which incidentally is 21%. So in this case, example ministry has got 7 years to achieve a 21% reduction. If they started in 2020, they would have 5 years to achieve a 21% reduction. Now, if they started in 2022, this is what it looks like. Okay, so they're starting out on the wrong side of the blue line. And in fact, they only have 1 to 3 years to get a 21% reduction. So if that emissions pathway didn't start in 2018, it started in 2022, obviously it is inadequate, whereas before it was adequate. So what that means is that if you're starting out your emissions reduction journey sooner, that is later, then you've got less time to make that 21% reduction. I'll just show you the other charts now. So we've been looking at chart emissions, which has just got all categories summed together. Chart emissions detail is essentially the same, except the bar is split into categories. So all 6 categories are down there in the legend, and it shows you the proportions of each. As you can see, example ministry is very heavy on category 3. We also have chart reductions, a fairly simple graph. It's just showing you the same information again, but expressed as percentage change compared to base year, rather than in tons of CO2 equivalent. And then finally, we have chart KPIs, which shows you the lines of projections and actual for each of those KPIs that you've set up. So tons of CO2 equivalent per whatever, in this case, millions of dollars of operating revenue, 50 staff, widgets, and customers. There's projections and actuals. As you'll see, there isn't any target level specified here because, yeah, as far as the carbon neutral government program is concerned and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, there isn't a specific requirement around these measures because they are relative measures. However, you might want to set a target level for some sort of intensity measure, but that's entirely up to you. You may well have a base year which is several years or a few years before the current time. If that's the case, then you'll have some emissions history that you can enter into the target setting tool under actuals. And this will appear on your charts. But we have a little problem. If your base year is in the past, obviously you want your projection to match the past. At the moment here, you can see the grey line is way above where these orange bars are. So essentially, we want our projection to match the actuals up until the present day. So this is how you do that. Go back to your inventory and work out what the differences are between the years. You'll see here that for example, ministry, the base year is 1718. So for 1819, I have worked out the change, which is simply the current year's activity data minus the previous year's activity data. And this has given me this column here of change. And likewise, I've done that for the next year as well, which is simply the current year's activity data minus the previous year's activity data. Now you can go ahead and take these values, change, and put them straight into projection here. And so what this is doing is making your projection mimic your actuals. Likewise, we'll do it for the next year. Copy, paste. If your emissions factors have changed from year to year, what you'll also want to do is put in the specific emissions factors for each year. So you can see I've worked this out for 1819 and 1920 simply by dividing tons of emissions by the activity data. And you can cut and paste this into EFs over here for 19 and 20. And now we can see here over on chart emissions that the grey line is now following the actuals, or at least close enough to it. There'll be slight variances because of the electricity emissions factor. And that's done on the basis of reduction as activity data. If you wanted to have the change as on the basis of percent change, these numbers obviously aren't right, but you can do it. You just have to work out the percentage changes. And I've done it in these columns here. It's simply the change in absolute terms divided by the value for the previous year. So if we wanted to use the second row of the projection here, set to percent change, we could copy and paste that value, or we could use an equal sign if you like to do that. But something's gone wrong, it's disappeared. And that's because you need to multiply it by 100. So because it's a percentage and because of the way we've set up the spreadsheet. So there we are, 8%. Let's do that for the next one. percentage change, it's 20%, and we times it by 100. And there we are. Now we can use the basis of reduction as percentage change. Now there is one other complication. This column here, H, the BAU growth trend, if we put in a percentage here, say 5%, we can see that that 5% growth is being applied to the past. Now, you probably don't want to do that. The idea is to make the projection match the actuals for the past, but there is an easy fix. Over here, we have this variable BAU growth start year. At the moment, it is set to the base year, but we can set it to any year. So if we set it to 2020, you can see that it's not kicking in until 2020, and now our projection is matching the actuals again. And you can make that as far out as you like, so 2025. You can see the BAU growth feature is not starting until 2025. So in this way, you can use the BAU growth trend feature and have your projection match your actuals for past years. When I was talking about actuals, I mentioned that it's possible to have a base year that is actually the average of up to 3 years. So I'm just going to demonstrate how to set that up if you were to use that. So if we look at actuals here, we've got the base year emissions pulled across from projections, and that can be different to the actual data points for individual years. So here in projection, what we need to do is put in averaged activity data. We'll go back to the inventory, and we can see here that we have activity data for 3 years. So let's average it. It's very simple, just average function of each of the 3 years for each emission source and each activity. Lots of decimal points there, get rid of a few decimal points. And there we go, averaged activity data for the period 2017 to 2020 financial years, that is. So now we simply copy that across to projection and paste it in here. Now we have an average base year. Now, there are various reasons why you might want to do that. Perhaps there was extenuating circumstances in the most recent year, which meant that you didn't think it really was a fair baseline to use to track your progress against. So if you've got data, verified data for 3 years or 2 years, you can average it instead. Now, the implications of this is that what you call your base year is actually different data to your actuals. So also another issue is that the target setting spreadsheet is set up to work with single numeric base years, not ranges. So this 3-year period, we have to allocate it to a single year. So I'm going to allocate it to 2020. Now when we go to put in actuals, you'll see here that 2020 does appear. Instead of just simply putting an equal sign and pulling across that data from this column D, which is our base year emissions, we want to put in the actual emissions because they are 2 different things now. One's an average and one isn't. So here is the data we want for 1920 emissions results. So we'll copy those across and drop them into actuals here. There we go. And so we can see that the average of the last 3 years is 1,071 tonnes of emissions, but the 2020 year on its lonesome is 656. So we can see that now on the charts. Here's chart emissions. You can see that the projected emissions and the 1.5 degree requirement are set up here at that average value. And then the actual for 2020, which is the start of our time series, is much lower. Of course, the average could go the other way, and your actual could be higher than your baseline, depending on how high that last year of emissions is compared to the average. If we did the opposite and set the base year to 2018, then went through here to our actuals. Just for argument's sake, if we did choose the first year of the time period to allocate our base year to, then here's 2020 over here. We go get 2019 and 2018 and drop them in. Let's have a look. Yep. So now you can see where the actuals are sitting relative to that averaged base year. So the average of 2018, 19 and 20 is around here at the 1073 mark. And then we have some of those years are above and some are below, of course, because that's how average works. Now I'm going to show you how to do a switch between a high emissions activity to a lower emissions activity. So when you're entering reductions, obviously, if you know a quantity of reduction that a project gives, then you can put it in. But that project might result in an increase somewhere else. Now this is the whole reason that the tool is based around activity data. It allows you to do this accurately. So say, for example, that example ministry had decided to use less business long-haul travel for its international flights and instead go on economy class because it has a lower emissions factor. So we can see here in the emissions factors, economy, business class is 47, economy is 16, so it's 1/3. So by doing that conversion, they could cut their emissions from flights by 2/3. So what does that look like? Well, entering percentages is no good because the amount of reduction in one area as it's expressed as a percentage isn't necessarily the same as the amount of increase you'd see in the other area. So I'm going to change it to activity data as the basis of reduction. So there's business class and here is economy class. All right, we'll set it to activity data. And let's say in 2020, 2021, that the number of passenger kilometers flown in business class, you're going to bring that, it's currently 1.397 million. Let's bring that down by 10%, so that's 140,000. Okay, so that one goes down, but of course, if they're all just flipping over to economy, then that one has to go up. Sorry, that one there should be a negative number. I'll just put that there. Negative is down, and then this one here can just be equals 140,000 extra passenger kilometers in a long-haul economy. So that is your fuel switch, and you can see it over here on the spark lines. One's dropped down, the other has popped up. And we should see an emissions reduction associated with that. And we can see a little dip there. Why don't we increase it a bit more to see if we can get a really big effect? Why don't we get rid of all of our first class air travel. So we'll change it to percentage reduction and go negative 100%. And then this one has to go up by the same amount, which is about 141.4 million passenger kilometres. There we go. There, done. Okay, so that's the same effect. Had one go up and the other go down. Now let's look at it. Boom, there we go. So there's a dramatic effect there from that switch. And that will be the same for any other kinds of activities that you're switching between. They may not necessarily have the same unit. So conveniently switching between forms of air travel, they're both in units of passenger kilometres. If you're switching to EVs, for example, they're not in the same unit. Vehicles use litres of fuel, combustion engine vehicles that is, whereas EVs use electricity. But it would be the same idea. You would reduce the amount of fuel used and increase the amount of electricity. And you probably use that on using the basis of activity data as opposed to percentage change, because then you're able to be explicit about the amount of change that occurs at each step. And you can make sure that those numbers line up properly. Another thing to bear in mind is that if you're fuel switching, say from coal to wood, you may not have the thing you're switching to in your base year inventory. So, and that's okay. What you need to do though is set up that emission source in emissions factors. So let's add in wood, that's in kilograms here. And then you would enter its emissions factor, whatever that is. We can look it up from the measuring emissions guide. I'll do that in a moment. But then over here in projection, you would put wood, that's category 1. And then in the base year, the activity level is 0, obviously. You're not actually using it in your base year, you're just setting up the emissions factor for use in later years, which is fine. And then, because it's starting out at 0, you can't use percent change as your basis of reduction. It has to be set to activity data, because 100% increase of 0% is still 0. You can't increase from 0 by a relative amount, only by absolute amount, which is why you have to have it set to activity data. Now, where should you get your emissions factors from if they're not already in your inventory? Well, I recommend the Measuring Emissions Guide published by the Ministry for the Environment, and there is a link to that here in the instructions. So that's where you can seek out your emissions factors if you don't have them, and then you can plug them in here. Remember, the units are tons of CO2 per unit of whatever, not kilograms, so there might be a times 1,000 issue that you need to look out for. Now I'm going to show you how to set up an organisation that has multiple business units. You'll notice, might have noticed, example ministry only has one business unit, whereas example council here has many business units, and also many of the emissions factors appear multiple times as a result because they pop up in each business unit. Now in the emissions factors sheet, we really only want to have each emissions factor appear only once. Just makes it tidier and simpler to update if we're not updating emissions factors in more than one place. So how do we do that? Well, it's a simple deduplication exercise. So let's just copy this entire slab of data here, and we'll just paste it down here. And now we'll go to the data tab of the ribbon, and then you'll see this symbol here, which has got 2 blue boxes and a red cross. This is remove duplicates. So click on that. See, my data has headers is selected, and we can see all the column names here. So we want to deduplicate the activity, that is the emission source. So we'll unselect all and select activity and go OK. And voila, we have each individual emissions factor. So this is ready to be copied across to the EFs tab. So we'll copy all of the emission source names, except electricity, which is already there. We will copy across the units. And then we will copy across the actual emissions factors of electricity. Okay. Fourth base here, which I believe in this case is 2016. Okay, so that's all set to go. We very quickly got rid of the duplicates, and now we can draw across in projection from this set of emissions factors rather than having any double ups. Well, that's pretty straightforward. However, what's not so straightforward is example DHB. So you can see it's a much larger, more complex organization in that it has multiple business units that each have multiple emission sources. So, of course, you can deduplicate the emissions factors just like I showed you. So let's do that now. Okay, data, remove duplicates, unselect all, select activity. Okay. 64 duplicate values were found and 37 remain. So we've dropped down from 103 to 37. So that's good. That is what we would have to copy across to the emissions factors tab. However, over on the projections tab, do you really want to be simulating or projecting the emissions for each one of those 100 and 102, 101 sources? It may not make sense to do that. Maybe it makes more sense to actually amalgamate some of these lines. Perhaps even you could go so far as to say, actually, for the purposes of target setting, I'm not interested in business unit at all. I want to combine them all together. So I'm just going to show you how to do that if you'd like to do that. And the way you do it is with a pivot table. So select the complete set of data, including the headers, and go to Insert Pivot Table, which is right over here on the left. Make sure it says New Worksheet and go OK. Okay. And then the pivot table fields you want to select are activity, and then the quantity and GWP. So now it has amalgamated all of the different business units and given you totals for the total quantity of each emissions source and the total emissions of each emission source. So there you go. In fact, you don't need that. You just need the quantities, sum of quantities. All right. So that is now ready to go over into projections. And if you do that, then you can manage all of your projections for each of these different emission sources all together rather than having to deal with each business unit individually. Now you might want to keep that business unit detail because perhaps some business units have got more potential for reduction than others, and therefore you want to simulate them separately, or maybe they've got some sort of limitation, which means they can't reduce, and therefore that's the reason you want to deal with them separately. But if the types of reduction measures you're talking about affect everything equally, then dealing with only 37 rows, 37 sources, and simulating each of those might be a much more attractive prospect than doing that for 101. Of course, you can amalgamate your emission sources in other ways too. The way I've done it is all consistent regarding the quantities and emissions factors. So there's absolutely no problem in terms of accuracy of outputs by amalgamating it that way. However, you might want to amalgamate together emission sources that are either very small or very similar, but actually have different emissions factors. So if that was the case, then you would have to work out what the average emissions factor was for that amalgamated source. And that wouldn't be too difficult. Once you amalgamated the total quantity with the total CO2, then it would simply be one number divided by the other would give you the average emissions factor. And that's what you would set up over here in the emissions factors worksheet, with some sort of unique name to indicate that it was actually an average of several emission sources rather than a completely unique emission source